Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Conversations Across Borders. I'm Riz Khan. I'm very honored to be your moderator and facilitator for this discussion that brings together more than 1,100 participants from 39 countries this week. So welcome to you all from all over the world. We have two wonderful guests. I'll get to those in just a moment, but let's again set the scene for what this discussion is about. Of course, a lot is centered nowadays on the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic, and its lockdown that affects everyone globally. And of course, that's putting all kinds of pressures and stresses on us as we try to deal with it. Not just, of course, the science of it in terms of protecting ourselves with equipment and social distancing and all the other recommendations we have, as well as the staying at home as much as possible. But also, of course, it's putting pressure on families in terms of the emotion of being together for long periods of time and sometimes the stresses that come as a result of those. And of course, it's putting a lot of people in the position of having to think about their faith and how that's been affected. Many people, of course, can't gather for religious prayer as they have been able to in the past, which is, of course, a very emotional thing for a lot of people. And of course, there is the issue of wondering what this virus may have in terms of any kind of religious significance. So these are the kind of issues we'll discuss as we get into this discussion this evening here in Dubai time. I want to welcome in our two guests. We have His Excellency Omar Saif Ghobash, is an Emirati diplomat and author, and he's the Assistant Minister in the United Arab Emirates Office of Cultural Diplomacy. Watching the misunderstandings and inaccurate portrayals of Islam in certain places around the world prompted him to communicate with his young sons about the importance of the true message of Islam, which he did through a best-selling and inspiring book, Letters to a Young Muslim. And we have with us also Leslie Hazelton, who's an award-winning journalist, historian, blogger, and author of a number of books, and particularly interesting one, of course, being The First Muslim, which is a look at Islam through the eyes of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and how the Muslim holy book, the Quran, was revealed to him. Leslie Hazelton has, of course, a lot of experience discussing issues of faith and religion, so we're very honored to have her with us as well. So our big question for this discussion on the issue of faith is, will science be the new religion in the post-pandemic world? Let's start with a question to each of our panelists to get this debate going. And I guess one of the things that has struck me is that major events that affect a large population, such as military conflict or natural disaster, and as we have it now, the COVID-19 pandemic, are experiences that create stress in society. To what degree do you believe that such stress is a driving force for people to turn to their faith as a source of either protection or comfort? I'm going to start with Omar Ghobash first and just see what your perspective is on that.
Thank you, Riz. Can you hear me well?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. You presented this as though we're going to have a debate and that we're on opposite sides of a particular position. Actually, Leslie and I are probably more likely to be on the same side. When it comes to what's happening with COVID and faith, I get the impression that actually people have now, including myself, have turned to CNN and Sky News and sort of public broadcasts, and we listen to the experts and these public spokespeople speaking as though they were talking some divine truth, and we hang on their every word and we interpret them much more than we would interpret, say, a U.S. president's points. Yeah, and there is a certain kind of parsing of the language and trying to figure out, and I mean, here in my own home, we have almost Talmudic discussions with the family about what exactly is possible and what isn't possible and what might be a worthy risk and what isn't. So in that sense, I think, yeah, we're splitting hairs of all kinds of things. So in that sense, perhaps there has been a turn to a kind of religion. Leslie, perhaps you might have something to counter with.
Please go ahead, Leslie, yes.
Well, I have trouble with this whole idea of a science versus religion or religion versus science, of a dichotomy between the two. I understood the question as stemming from the fact that some mosques, some churches, both here in the United States and there in the Middle East, in fact, around the world, some religious leaders have insisted on holding services, packed crowds of services, despite COVID, and in defiance of government recommendations and even orders. And they're doing this, they say, in the name of God, in the name of piety, in the name of religion. And it makes me wonder, you know, we know there's a clear relationship, right, between packed crowds and spread of COVID. So this is an excellent way to spread COVID. And I understand, you know, that a lot of people are saying, well, you know, inshallah, you know, I place my life in the hands of God. If I get COVID from being in a church service or in a Friday mosque, and so on, then you know, so be it. That's the will of God. To which my response is, how selfish can you possibly be? And how is this selfishness related to your supposed faith? What right do you have? If you want to kill yourself, if you want to take the risk, that's fine by me, right? You want to be dumb enough to risk getting COVID, fine, get it. No, that's not my business. What you are risking is other people's lives. What you are risking is the life of the community. And the community is so central, especially in Islam. So what kind of responsibility are you showing to the community? What kind of Muslim are you when piety becomes selfishness and basically arrogance? The insistence on being part of a community, in fact, harms the community. And you know, this is in direct contradiction to everything in the Quran, where the community and the welfare of the community is uppermost.
Leslie, I was going to actually get onto that issue of communal worship a little bit in the conversation. At this point, what I was getting at in that opening question, and I didn't see you and Omar as being on opposite sides in any way, but I do wonder whether you think that faith provides some degree of comfort, at least, and I don't mean in terms of having to go for communal worship, but as a psychological thing. Is it comforting? Do people see it as a way to protect themselves?
I don't know if people see it as a way to protect themselves, but yes, of course, there's comfort in it. That's why religion lasts. There is comfort in a certain kind of surrender to what is happening rather than struggling against it all the time. There is comfort in the knowledge that it affects us all, that you are part of a community and so on. There is so undoubtedly, and especially in times of stress, in times of war also. But in times
let me do one thing
then.
Leslie, let me get Omar Gobash's response to this, what you had said earlier about, you know, people perhaps being selfish if they think that they're still entitled for communal worship. I want to get His Excellency's response to that.
Yeah, I think this is a subject that needs to be discussed. It's not, I mean, in society itself. I think there have been different approaches to this. The major part of the Muslim world has, you know, all agreed basically to stop going to the mosques, or if you're going to go to a mosque, then you do the social distancing or physical distancing that's required. I think there's a parallel problem, which is that I've noticed particularly religious people walking around town don't wear the mask, whereas, you know, people who don't wear their faith on their sleeves are wearing their masks. And I've been wondering publicly about that. Why are people who are clearly very religious not wearing the mask? And it may be that, yes, they are sort of submitting themselves to God's will and so on. But then there's that whole debate within Islam about what it is exactly that you know, what is it that God's will is? Is it for you to, you know, move and make your own decisions and protect yourself? Or is it to submit completely and just get swept away? And I think that question of responsibility is a huge one. The other thing is, I agree with you on the selfishness, but I think many people don't quite realize that actually the mask is to protect others from your disease as opposed to protect you from others' disease.
Right.
You know, the spreading of the particles is, yeah. So I think this question of responsibility really needs to be tackled in this question. In this sphere.
Yeah, and I would argue that in fact, those who insist on gathering in close quarters in order to worship, who insist on going without a mask because it's inshallah, it's God's will and so on. This is not good faith. This is bad faith. This is performative religion. It's performative piety. Look how pious I am. Look how religious I am. I leave it up to God and so on and so on. I'm going to ignore anything that the doctors say, anything that the epidemiologists say and so on. There's no real commitment here. This isn't faith.
Well,
this is performative piety, and there's no content to it. There's no inner sense of faith to it.
Omar, you want to
Leslie,
add something?
yeah, I wanted to add because this subject came up in a different way a few days ago amongst some friends. We had all been tested and we had all been quarantined together, so it made sense to chat without masks. But there was a question of what is strong faith, and it was it's something that actually happened. A man was driving with his family on the highway. He decides he wants to stop for tea. He stopped on the side of the highway and allowed his children out of the car. Two of them started running across the road as he was making the tea or drinking the tea and were killed. And the story is that he had such powerful faith in God that he was not affected by the death of his children. And he said, well, you know, this is God's will. Now, we actually had a debate about it. It wasn't that clear. So many people were admiring of his faith. And then there were the others who were saying, what kind of faith is it that says you're not fully responsible for those around you? And I think it's the same kind of thing, but maybe it just gives a kind of starker contrast and one that is actually, you know, acted out in real life and it's quite horrific.
Yeah.
Omar, I've got a question. Sorry, Leslie, before you get in, a quick question to follow up with, Omar. Do you think it's possible to get people, irrespective of the strength of their faith, or let's say actually it would affect people more with the strong faith, to respect science without kind of compromising their faith? How does one actually get them to respect science without making them feel they're having to compromise their faith?
You know, maybe I differ from the average Muslim in that I've never really had a problem with science itself. You know, there's no direct contradiction that I can see, and I suppose that would go with, you know, I probably disagree with Christian fundamentalists who have a problem with evolution. I think, from what I understand, the biggest problem that the religious have with science is evolution. For me, the genesis, the start of it all, is very metaphorical. It's a parable. It's a story. It's imagination. And so for that reason, I don't see any particular problem with that. I do think, though, that in the presentation and the documentation behind this talk, there is this idea that science itself is certain and that there are certainties that we can point to. I think that science is actually highly politicized anyway, because it's human beings who perform science, and it is a practice as opposed to some kind of a set of results that we can point to and say, we know for certain. And I think that's why there's actually a kind of similarity between the two. And I think what you've seen, particularly in the UK, when they repeatedly say, you know, we're following the science, we're following the science. For a long time, many of us believed that science was something that had specific things to say and you couldn't be countered. And then we realized that there are many political decisions being shielded by scientific authority.
Leslie, your response to that?
Well, first of all, I want to respond to the story of the father and the two kids being run over in the road, to which my instant response is, thank God he wasn't my father. Yeah, thank God I wasn't one of those kids. Yeah. You know, I mean, he doesn't even grieve for his children. Yeah. I can't tell you that that story is going to haunt me. This whole thing, you know, it's a very, that image of science as being somehow counter to religion or trying to explain everything or being certain about everything is a very fundamentalist idea of what science is. You know, I mean, bad science might be like that, you know, bad religion's like that too. You know we have the answer to everything and so on and so on. But good science, like good faith, does not have the answer to everything. I mean, science is based on inquiry. And inquiry depends on never knowing for certain. You always want to find out more. You always know that whatever you know already is questionable. You want to go further. You want to check it out further. So doubt and uncertainty are built into a good scientist's approach to the world. And so, I want to point out, is a sense of wonder and awe at the world. I mean, I can quote Einstein to you ad infinitum about the beauty and harmony of the world and his awe at it. And I will do if you give me a chance. But it's, I think any good scientist has that sense of mystery, of awe and wonder that is also the basis of real faith. I'm not talking about performative faith. I'm not talking about ritual and dogma. I'm talking about the experience of faith, the inner experience, the religious experience itself. And that, I think, is based on awe and wonder at how we are all here, how this world came into being, the marvel of it all, and the terror of it all.
In a couple of minutes, I'm going to get on to a poll question to get our participants to get involved. But before I do, because I want to follow up on what's being discussed right now to keep up with the theme, two things. One, we had a question from one of our participants that was sent in earlier saying, why do people have to speak about science and religion as if they're mutually exclusive? And this was from Jumana in the USA. And it led me to a question a friend of mine, Ibrahim al-Nasser in Kuwait, sent to me saying, what about when you have science revealed in ancient religious texts, which hasn't been proved by modern day scientists yet? What about these revelations that are essentially scientific in the text? And Omar, I want to touch on that because I know it's something you've discussed.
There seems to be, at least within my Islamic experience, there's a trend among certain people to say, look, you know, there's been a new scientific discovery in the West. It was predicted in the Quran. It was always there. We knew it. Therefore, this proves that the Quran is truly a miracle, and so on. I don't know. I think that's kind of it reflects a deep insecurity about what it is that we're doing as Muslims. And this is paralleled by the idea. I think it started in the late 70s in the U.S. And perhaps in Pakistan as well. The idea of the Islamization of sciences. So you can have a physics that is particularly Muslim, or a mathematics that is Muslim. I think we within the faith, we, at least publicly, we idealize science, and we think of it as something that is almost holy, and then we apply the wrong standard to it. I always sort of roll my eyes when I hear somebody sort of explaining the scientific facts that have been already demonstrated. I don't think that, you know, that is what our religion is about. I don't think that it needs to be about science. I don't think it needs to prove anything scientific. And I think that we as Muslims should really be looking at our texts as explainers, or rather giving meaning to our lives, as opposed to, you know, being predictors of certain scientific discoveries later on.
All right, Leslie, your thought on that as well?
Reminds me of a conversation I had in Pakistan with a guy who's, you know, very high tech and so on, who was arguing precisely this, that that Islam, the Quran in particular, is very scientific, and it's all kinds of scientific facts and so on, and how scientific it was to be a Muslim believer. And I'm saying, you know, I'm making my usual argument about how surely this is a matter of poetry more than of science, you know. And he looked so insulted when I mentioned the word poetry. I'm saying, this is not an insult. This is beauty. This is harmony. This is everything that Einstein talked about. You know, why are you insulted by the idea of being poetic? Why are you trying to limit yourself to a very, very narrow definition or narrow concept of what science is? Science is based, as I say, on awe and wonder and curiosity and inquiry and just, how does this work? How does this happen? Going further, exploring.
I like to point out to people in America, often when I'm doing moderating events and stuff in live events, I like to tell them that actually the words alchemy and algebra both actually come from the Middle East. Religion apart, they're actually something that they don't realize the roots of those words. I'm going to get in a poll question here, so our participants, let's say we have about 1,100, more than 1,100 in 39 countries joining us, watching this. So the first poll I want to bring up here is about people attending communal religious worship centers, because that's going to be an interesting thing to look at in just a moment when we get the result. Post-pandemic, this is what the question says, the poll question. Post-pandemic, will more people attend communal religious worship centers like mosques, churches, synagogues, and temples, etc.? So you, our participants, please do click yes or no. Do you think post-pandemic, will more people attend communal religious worship centers such as mosques, churches, synagogues, and temples? Yes or no, and we'll get a result and then put it to our panelists. And that should come up in a minute, because people around the world can just click on that and we collate the information. And that's going to be an interesting topic for us to discuss anyway, because there's a lot of people, obviously wanting to get back to communal worship, but then there's obviously going to be the issue of people worried about going into places where they are gathering. And perhaps, Omar, when we get the result, I can put it to you first as that comes in. We should get that result right now. Here we go. Okay, 45% of people say yes, that after the pandemic, there will be more people attending communal religious worship centers, while 55%, it's not a huge split actually, believe they won't be. What's your impression, Omar, on the reaction after the pandemic?
This is assuming the pandemic ends and we're out in a new world,
Yeah,
or
true. Yes,
okay.
let's assume we can go back to what we considered normal lives,
Yeah.
even they
Well, this is a
never
bit,
maybe.
and this is a kind of a very similar to the question of that a lot of people put: will we have a better world? Will we be constructing a better world after COVID, or will things get worse? Most people I spoke to seem to think that things would be better. We'd be gentler with each other. We'd be kinder, and we'd have a new kind of capitalism and so on. My instinct and what I see is that actually, you know, the rich will get richer, the tough will get tougher. Survival of the fittest will really come to the fore. So that may result actually in more people going to places of communal worship.
Let's
Yeah,
get
otherwise it's a very difficult question.
Leslie, what's your thought? Will fear of the virus and this kind of post-pandemic mentality keep people away from communal gatherings for religious worship? Or will more go?
Well, my question is, what is the purpose of communal gatherings? The sense of community, most definitely. But what are we saying? That God is hard of hearing? That he can only hear millions of people during the Hajj, or 10 Jews? Why are 10 Jews necessary for a minyan, let alone 10 male ones, right? God can't hear one. Of course he can. She can, it can, right? So the question here is it's a challenge to organized religion. And you know, maybe, or maybe I'm just being over optimistic, or maybe I'm just being pie in the sky, but there might be a silver lining to this whole COVID thing. And that is, it will make us think again, or reconceive what it is to be religious, what it is to pray, whether together or in isolation. Maybe it will lead to a form of religion that's a little bit less organized. I'm not saying disorganized, but less organized, less in the control, because basically organized religion is a kind of power play, you know. So what if, like we're doing now through Zoom, you know, it's an enormous number of people watching and listening in. What if, it would crash Zoom, of course, but I had this image in my mind of, what if every Friday there were communal Zoom prayer for Muslims throughout the world? Black Muslims, brown Muslims, white Muslims, Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslims, old Muslims, young women, female, male, and so on and so on. And every time, every Friday, it was a different imam from a different country, a different ethnicity, a different skin color, a different gender, and so on, or non-gender. Wouldn't that be exciting? You could pray together. You could pray together apart. I mean, what I'm thinking is, you know, what we have here is a huge technological revolution going on at the same time as a huge revolution enforced on us by the pandemic. Maybe we can put those two things together and reconceive the ways that we express faith, the ways that we perform faith.
Let me expand what you've said there and put it to Omar Ghobash. One of the things, if I'm not much mistaken, using Islam as an example, is the idea of people being together after prayer. They turn to each other and they greet each other. And it's a way to socially interact that, of course, technology alone wouldn't allow us to through these kind of online gatherings. There is an element of being together that is supposed to be beneficial. Omar, is it possible that you know, people get the same experience without having that communal gathering?
Actually, you know, my experiences over the last couple of months interacting with people online has been remarkable. Actually, it you know, it kind of shortens the gap to another person. So I think it's a great idea to think of how technology and religion can come together. And there's absolutely no reason why we couldn't sort of develop a virtual reality mosque. So you are sitting beside your fellow Muslim, and you know, have for all of the other faiths if necessary. So I think that kind of out of the box thinking is great, but I just don't see within the traditional Orthodox structures any of that really happening.
Well, that's what I was wondering, whether or not people emotionally can. I mean, obviously you're applying a fair amount of logic and you're tech savvy and so on, but for a lot of people there isn't that kind of option.
Yeah, I'm not tech savvy at all, to be honest. I had my son set this up for me. So,
That's fair enough.
yeah.
And he's giving you that
I
amazing angelic lighting. We have to point that out.
especially for today.
That's exactly it.
But I would say that I find it interesting that in Western states, particularly in Western Europe and in the US, there are very innovative and creative thinkers about religion in general, but in Islam, about Islam in particular. And some of the leading figures within the Muslim world are actually Western-born or converts from Western countries, which to me shows that there really is a kind of a wedge that can be put in place to push our thinking into so that it's more aligned with what is possible than what isn't.
You know, I'm going to bring in a question that came in from a viewer as well, because this is an interesting thing relating to what we're talking about. I'm sure there are people who are listening, some that might take offense at the idea of religion going online exclusively, for example, and some people, you know, taking offense to various perspectives on religion. So I'm going to just put this to you, actually, Leslie. It's coming from Hamdan in the UAE, who says, how can we discuss and debate religion in a very religious society? There are, for a lot of people, restrictions in what they can and can't say.
Hi, Hamdan. It's an excellent question. When there are restrictions on free speech, and both social and legal.
I should point out, by the way,
there
may not be official restrictions. Sometimes a person themselves feels conditioned not to question as well. Yeah. So that's an element too.
Yeah, and that's where I think, you know, this tech revolution has played a huge part. It's allowed so many people who were kind of closed in to discover what's happening elsewhere. I mean, the example that Omar brought up of so many really progressive, interesting leading Muslim thinkers here in the United States is astonishing, and people are getting to hear them. So instead of the sort of sorry, old white men with beards, but instead of the old white men with beards droning on and on and on, you know, so like sometimes I wonder, God, do Muslims just enjoy being preached at all the time? You know, I mean, it's endless, you know, for hours on end. But now there's real thinking going on and real interacting going on. And yes, of course, interacting can happen online. It's what we're doing right now, right? It's, and like Omar, I've had, you know, in this last couple of months, it can be actually more intense because you're focused, right? Yeah, you're not distracted by this and that and so on. And it's, you know, everything from book clubs, reading Shakespeare, doing Pilates mat, and so on and so on. All these things which, you know, are totally trivial compared to, you know, well, not Shakespeare, he's not trivial, but compared to what we're talking about now could also be, you know, this is a space for real interaction, and real interaction beyond what we were capable of before. Before we had to be face to face in the same physical space. We don't need that anymore, so we can reach out. So, so long as the governments, so long as authoritarian governments do not, which they do, I know, do not clamp down on social media, do not turn off Twitter and Facebook and so on and so on. So long as they do not do that, and this is why they do clamp down, because they can see that this is how people are exploring, are thinking. You know, if you're an authoritarian government, the last thing you want is a population capable of thinking.
One thing I'm curious, as we look at what we're discussing here in the context of the pandemic, is balancing obviously what are the benefits from faith and what are the benefits from science, which is where we had started. And you know, as someone who was in the science world myself, my degree was in physiology, specializing in neurology. It became very clear to me that stress obviously has a negative impact on the physiology. And I'm wondering, in the same way that perhaps faith, if it does relieve anxiety and does promote this kind of positive thinking, can actually have a positive impact on health and its immunity.
Of course it does.
Well, Leslie, go ahead first.
Yes, of course it does. I mean, you know, it's a bit weird to think of it in physiological terms, but yes, we know it does, right? We know that people who have religious faith, and again, I'm talking about faith. I'm not talking about performative religion. I'm talking about real faith, right? Inner faith, inside faith. Yeah, it helps you through, and much more difficult without it. You have to do a lot more thinking and a lot more struggling. It's worth it, in my opinion, since I am a resolute agnostic, but not, I can see that not many people might want that. But the people I know of real faith are not those who perform it most. Those who perform it most are very often, so far as I can see, those who lack that inner faith, that inner sense of the transcendent, of the divine, of the infinite, or however you want to think of it, whether you call it God or Allah or any other name. That sense that there's more to the world than your small existence in it, that you are part of something larger, which is that community, which is part of that sense of ummah that's throughout the Quran and so on, and that calls continuously for responsibility to that community, which is where we started with the COVID thing, wearing masks and social distance and not gathering in large groups.
Leslie, I'm going to ask you to chip in a quick answer to a question that came from Elias here in the UAE, who sent it in advance, one of our participants. He says, how many years did you spend studying the Quran?
You're not allowed to say, you're not allowed to answer in days or months or weeks, it seems.
Right. I spent many years studying psychology. He knows, he's seen the TED Talk, he knows exactly the answer to this. I spent 3 months full time with it, sort of, all over the place. I'd said in the TED Talk it was only 4 different versions of it. In fact, there were at least a dozen. But so he's going to say that because I haven't studied the Quran my whole life, therefore I shouldn't even Quran.
I don't know if that was meant to be a loaded question. It might have been an interesting question. I'm going to put this to
no. Let's go back to it because this kind of first of all, she's a woman. Secondly, she's a Jew. Thirdly, she only studied the Quran full time for 3 months and without a responsible imam in charge and so on and so on. Fourthly, what right does she have to say anything at all about Islam? This is what he's getting at. And Elias, I'm sorry, but just if you were going to take that attitude, then just about every Muslim is going to be unable to talk about Islam with you, right? Maybe, I have no idea how long you have studied the Quran or under what conditions and so on. I have no doubt that you probably can quote the whole of it word for word. I have a very, very, very strong doubt that you have absorbed its message.
Well, I'm going to now, I mean, I read it quite innocently as that question, but I'm going to put to having listened to what Leslie said there, Omar, do you separate faith and religious practice in the way Leslie described that?
Actually, I think it raised a really interesting thought for me. I remember reading, firstly, I think that actually Islam is a very performative religion. And it's a very sensual religion, and it's a very sensory-based religion. So listening to the Quran being recited is a very, very powerful feeling, even if you don't understand what's being said. I found reciting the Quran according to the laws of recitation have a tremendous effect. Now, when I was learning how to do this, I was told that this was, spirituality, this was an interaction with the divine. I had an alternative explanation that perhaps it was, setting up vibrations in my third eye and so on. So we can't forget that we're actually biological beings and that there are certain things that can happen to you biologically. I also remember reading that dancing in groups has the same kind of biochemical syncing effect. It gives a certain amount of pleasure. There's a kind of, there's an elevated feeling. So I think that there is something about communal practices, whether you're praying or dancing or singing or whatever. I sing in a choir. So tell me that doesn't feel amazing, right?
Could I please exclude the Macarena from that?
So I think actually the performative side of religion has a massive effect, and much of what is performative is then interpreted as being very spiritual.
Let me get another poll question.
But there was another aspect, because you presented it as though, there are benefits to science and the benefits to religion, and perhaps, that's how you should go about it. I actually think that that's the wrong way to look at religion. And I often think to myself, what if actually following Islam was a particularly onerous task? I believe that it is the correct faith. I don't want to get into the veracity of other faiths, but I do believe that. And so if it weren't comfortable, it wouldn't change the way I approach it. right? So I mean, there has to be a sense of truth, whether it's good for you or bad for you or comfortable for you or not.
Let me bring in a poll question here because it touches on what we're discussing too. This second poll question asks about science and faith being balanced. And the question is, and I ask our participants who are all listening in right now to get ready to vote and just click yes or no on this. The question is, do we need faith, gut instinct, and emotional intelligence in addition to clinical sciences to overcome the pandemic? So that's the question. Do we need faith, gut instinct, and emotional intelligence in addition to clinical science to overcome the pandemic? Click yes or no, and we'll get a vote on that fairly quickly. While we're discussing that, while we're waiting for the result on that, from what I gather, there's a lot of science in the religious practice anyway. For example, there are people who interpret it that way. For example, with prayer, the movement, the way the positions of the movements are, for example, promoting blood flow. This is the kind of things I hear, that the recitation, as you say, has certain vibration and tone that can have a positive impact. There's a lot of science often in what are considered ancient practices. Let me get this result out quickly to everyone. So the question, do we need faith, gut instinct, and emotional intelligence in addition to clinical sciences to overcome the pandemic? 87% of people, the vast majority, say yes, we do. So we need a combination. 13% say no, we don't. So thank you for clicking on that vote. We'll get one more poll in before the program ends.
Can I respond to the question that you put, the poll? It would seem to me that it's quite clear that you need emotional intelligence. The disease is a social thing. It spreads socially, and you need a bit of social intelligence to figure out that you shouldn't be doing certain things. Clinical science isn't going to explain that to you. It'll just tell you this is how you get the disease. So,
Leslie, what did you make of that poll? People looking really for a balance between the clinical sciences.
I agree, except for the thing about gut instinct. Gut instinct, I don't think is going to get us anywhere. Gut instinct says, I'm not sure what gut instinct says. Gut instinct for some people says fear, run away, and so on. Gut instinct for others says screw it all. And gut instinct for others says.
I think some of the eating habits in isolation probably leading to gut instinct in a number of ways.
No, gut instinct, I think, is a. Sorry. You should put it in common sense instead of gut instinct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe that was the reference. I think that was the idea. So just carrying on with this. At what point? Well, I want to ask each of you individually, and Leslie, starting with you, where do you see the boundary between faith and science to lie? At what point does science lose its relevance to faith for some people?
Okay, I threatened to read you Einstein. Hand up. Okay. Now you're going to get Einstein. This is what he said: the most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. Now, he saw the universe as, and I quote, a great eternal riddle. And he said, the beauty and belief in the logical simplicity of order and harmony that we can grasp only humbly and imperfectly. And note the words here, the beauty, harmony, imperfectly, humbly. I mean, these are words that could have come from the Quran itself. They're beautiful. And just look at the paradigms. Some of the leading paradigms in modern physics today. You've got Einstein's two theories of relativity, not certainty, relativity. You've got Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, not certainty. Of course, it's hard to talk about Heisenberg without thinking of Breaking Bad. I told you, do you have Breaking Bad there?
Yeah. Amazing, yeah.
And then you've got Gödel's incompleteness theorems, right? Incompleteness. The good science is based on uncertainty, on imperfection, on not knowing, on so much that the faith that Einstein expressed in the order and harmony of the world. This could be a religious person talking, but here's what he saw: bad science. And there's lots of bad science out there, like there's lots of bad religion out there. He called it uninspired empiricism. And I love that word, uninspired empiricism. Because yes, there can be inspired empiricism. And he said, both the fanatical atheists and the religious fanatics are creatures who can't hear the music of the spheres. Both the fanatical atheists and the religious fanatics, creatures who can't hear the music of the spheres. That, to me, is the music of the spheres. Is that not the essence of the religious experience? together with, as we were talking before, that sense of community, that sense of being part of something larger than yourself, which, yes, can elevate you, whether you're dancing in a crowd or you're, you know, cheering out, you know, when there's a home run at a baseball game, or when you hear the Quran being sung, chanted beautifully, or when you're one of 60,000 people in a silent march through downtown Seattle, like yesterday, in the pouring rain for Black Lives Matter. That sense of being part of something larger than yourself.
I'm going to ask Omar to tackle that same issue then. Where does that boundary lie between science and faith, and what point you see one potentially negating the other? I should chip in, by the way, I just happened to be talking to my daughter yesterday, and the joke that came up said, never trust an atom. They make up everything. Omar, over to
you. That's a good one.
All right, well, I can't quote Einstein because it's already been done.
Sorry.
I have to get rid of my notes. I've been wondering, it isn't as straightforward as people might think. I don't necessarily think of there as a massive clash, but I think of there as a difference in approach. And that's part of why we have a problem, in that the traditional, almost authoritarian approach within religious communities.
Nice.
Once you've joined a community, it's very, very clear what the rules are and who makes the decisions within that community. I don't know very many open, kind of free-thinking communities that can sort of self-organize, but it feels like there's something missing. And I think that actually the power of curiosity, as Leslie has said, and the power of doubt, and the idea that there are multiple ways of seeing the same truth would be very, very useful within any religion in the 21st century. And I think it's that idea that we need to have, there are multiple perspectives for the same phenomenon that needs to be taken into account. And I think, to be honest, Riz, when I wrote my book, I wasn't writing about the truth of Islam or true Islam. I was trying to present the fact that everybody has a perspective on the same object, and that is what creates the difference between us.
While I've got you, Omar, on this, the situation that will happen post-pandemic, I wonder if you think that the experience we're all having now in terms of isolating and connecting in this way through technology and not gathering the way we used to, not being able to express faith the way we used to perhaps, how do you think people will come out of this? Do you think they will actually be kinder to each other? Will there be more humanity, as we like to think of it? Will there be more philanthropic activity? Will there be some kind of awakening or spiritual enlightenment? How do you see what's going to happen?
Yeah, I see this mostly in the context of a global system of capitalism, to be honest. And I think that actually, there are some very, very hungry hedge funds out there that would like to take full advantage of the situation. So, when you think of that economic machine at the heart of what we live, that for me is more the driving force than anything else. And it's if you can persuade that machine to slow down, then you will have made progress. What are the chances of that happening?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That machine, though, it represents a kind of elite. What about the masses?
But that elite essentially controls through finance much of what happens in the world.
Yeah, so that's what I'm wondering, as individuals.
Leslie in San Francisco would know about that, I think.
Yeah. The heart of many places, many companies. I was going to ask, though, in sense of as individuals, do you think individuals, forgetting that kind of the elite layer that will obviously control a lot of changes, do you think individuals will come out of this differently?
What I've seen actually is a lot of people saying, look, I can't control it, and I might as well go out and enjoy myself. You only live once. So there seems to be a massive amount of short-termism happening, and a grabbing of opportunities for pleasure and carefree enjoyment.
Actually, Leslie, it's interesting. A lot of people are talking about things like revenge buying, people going out and buying it, a lot when they don't need things, and just because things open up. How do you think individuals might turn out post-pandemic? I mean, obviously it's a very general question, but I mean, generally, do you think there will be kind of any enlightenment?
It's like what they say about people as they get older. They don't change; they just become more who they already are. I don't know. I'd love to think that there was going to be a major change in awareness and social awareness, in wokeness and so on, as they say now. We're in the middle of a major change right here in the United States right now to Black Lives Matter, with the death of George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd, and the reaction to it. The protests are ongoing and will keep on being ongoing. And this time, finally, at last, decades late, and in fact, centuries late, there could actually be real change, because so many people are involved, white, brown, and black. But I don't know, this idea that we will get back to the old normal, will there be a new normal? The idea of normality, I think, is totally up in the air right now. Depends how long it lasts, depends how long until a vaccine, if there is a vaccine. And of course, you know, then it depends how long until the vaccine is fully distributed. And then you have the 25–30% of Americans who are going to refuse to take the vaccine because they're anti-vaxxers, sometimes for religious reasons, sometimes just because they're dumb. Let's not put it
I've got no bleep capability, so I'm glad you bleeped yourself. Thank you.
And that's going to happen worldwide too. So, you know, we look to science right now. We're looking to the researchers to come up with a vaccine to solve the problem of the pandemic. You know, there will be another one and another one and another one. This isn't the first, right? We know it from SARS and MERS and so on and so on. We have to organize as a society, which of course was not done. We had to be prepared for more pandemics and so on. How will this knowledge change us? I don't know. I have absolutely no idea. Like I say, what you hope for the better and fear for the worst.
Let me bring in a question. Actually,
we have the better angels, and of course
we hope. Yeah, we've enjoyed the blue skies. Let's hope they last as well. I'm going to bring in a question here from Saudi Arabia. Murshed wrote in because Omar, actually, one of the things that has come out is it's also the pandemic and the restrictions have also created negative opportunities. And in the case of Murshed here from Saudi Arabia, he says, for example, religious intolerance is on the rise in places like India, more so during this time. What's the way forward?
Yeah, I read that question earlier, I think, and or at least it came up in a different form. And I didn't have an answer for myself then. I don't have an answer right now either. You know, there's political opportunists who will take advantage of that kind of opportunity, and division is one way in which you can build up your constituency. We've seen it in many different parts of the world, and it seems to be kind of flavor of the decade in some way.
Let me put another one to you then, Omar. It's from Alan here in the United Arab Emirates. He says, how can religious institutions help non-religious people in times of crisis?
Wow. I only have an example from, well, there is an example here in the Emirates where we open our mosques to, and we have people to bring in non-Muslims to show them, you know, what goes on in the mosque. The only other kind of example that comes to mind, which has been effective, comes from the Orthodox Jewish community, which is a bit funny for me to be talking about. But you know, the idea of Chabad houses. If you're Jewish but not observant, you can still sort of pop in and still be welcomed. And I know from my own experience, even if you're not Jewish, you're still welcome. So, you know, there is that sense in which, you know, religions or religious organizations can be open and accepting of you as a human being. And I think that's, you know, very admirable.
I can bring in one more quick question here from a poll question, and we can discuss that. This is the third poll question we had. It says, can we find solutions from religious texts to help us deal with this pandemic? I'm going to ask our participants to vote, yes or no. Can we find solutions from religious texts to help us deal with this pandemic? So please click yes or no if you think one or the other. And we'll get that to our panelists in just a second as we enter the last sort of phase, last few minutes of this conversation. Omar, before we see the result, what's your thought on that? Do you think that we can find solutions from religious texts?
Perhaps some emotional solace, but you know, nothing more than that, I think.
And as I think Leslie's indicated earlier, it's important, you know, what religious leaders put out in terms of message as well. Leslie, what do you think? Oh, hang on, before you do, just let me give you the result. 61% say, can we, yes, we can find solutions from religious texts, while 39% say that no, that's not the case. Leslie, go ahead, sorry.
I have a problem with the idea of looking for solutions anywhere, let alone in religious texts. I find many things in religious texts, solace, as I can see solace, as Omar pointed out. I can see inspiration. I can see wonder and awe. But this idea of looking for solutions, I mean, many people will also look to science for solutions. The idea that there may, so I would like to introduce the idea that life is not about solutions. We're not going to solve everything, right? It's a process. It's an experience. It's an adventure. It's basically, there's only one solution to life, and that's death. You solve life when you die. That's the end of it, right?
Not the best solution, really, is it?
It's the inevitable solution, right? It's the resolution, as it were. So I think this idea of looking for solutions, something that will solve it all, it's very human. It's very, it's like, it's like why we read, we call them mysteries, right? They're not really mysteries, but why we read detective novels and so on, because it's always solved. There's always a solution, a resolution. Everything gets explained. So we're always looking for explanations of everything. And bad science claims to explain everything. Bad religion claims to explain everything. But, can we not just stay open to the idea that not everything can be explained, that not everything can be or even needs to be solved, but experienced?
That's a very wonderful, intriguing thought. I'm going to put, perhaps with just a minute to spare, to His Excellency Omar Gabash.
Yeah, I'm not going to respond to that. I'm going to respond to a question that you haven't asked, and it was on the list of questions, the Q&A. Very interesting question to Leslie. It's from a self-described Muslim woman, and she asks why she should read your books. And I'd like to answer it before you do, because I read two of your books. I read two of your books, and I found them absolutely fascinating, absolutely gripping, and completely mesmerizing. Particularly the one on the Sunni-Shia divide, because it put it in a way that allowed me to take a step back from our own intercommunal descriptions of that. It allowed me to take almost an objective view, or to take an objective view of the difference. And there is something also about the way in which you imagine what an individual, in the case of the first Muslim, the Prophet Muhammad, but you actually put yourself in his position and imagine why he might have done something, what he might have thought, and it created such depth. It got me thinking immediately. So I would highly recommend your books to everybody, and in particular Muslims who are looking for a slightly different perspective on what we're traditionally taught.
Wonderful. Leslie, unfortunately, we're out of time, but that's great to get.
Thank you, Omar. You said it so much better than I could.
And you had such a sincere smile as His Excellency said that. Omar Gabash, Leslie Heselton, thank you both for this wonderful discussion. Of course, a very complex and interesting one that will never be easily finished in 1 hour, but thank you for giving up the time to take the discussion on board.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody who's listening and watching.
Thank you. And don't forget the books. So the discussion, as I say, could certainly go on, but we are out of time. I want to thank you very much for taking part. All those people across the world that have joined us, really good to have you on board, creating a very low carbon footprint discussion. I'm going to hand over now to a person who's been obviously one of the key people in getting us together in this conversation. She's the CEO and trustee of the Emirates Literature Foundation. So over to Isabel Abulhoum.
I just unmuted myself, sorry. I was completely mesmerized. I was in awe and wonder. Thank you both hugely so much.
Thank you.
I told you beforehand that I wouldn't say a huge thank you unless it was deserved. And my goodness, Your Excellency Omar Gabash, truly deserved. Thank you so much. And to Leslie in Seattle in the morning, thank you again for really, really getting in there and making this a true debate, a true conversation. Riz, you charted us through quite difficult waters, so thank you so much for that.
Still paddling.
Still paddling. You are brilliant. And I would just like to say to thank you for the thousands of people from all over the world who've tuned in. You are the reason we do it. Without an audience, why would we bother? We need you, and thank you for taking part in the polls. Thank you to the wonderful Office of Public and Cultural Diplomacy, who has felt this was an important thing to do, and we are reaching far, far more people and places than we could ever have dreamed. This is a whole series. We've had sustainability, we've had religion, if you like, versus science. We've had current events. Next week, tune in for emotional rescue. We've got poetry on a powerful panacea for the pandemic with Afra Atiq, our wonderful Emirati poet, Carlos Gomez from New York, and the wonderful Lem Sissay from the United Kingdom. So every week, Saturday, you will find something different, something special. And on that note, I would like to just say a huge thank you, and keep tuning in, keep reading, and keep being in awe and wonder of our world. Thank you.